Sergeant Carl Rodriguez had been a steadying presence for the squad, pragmatic, blunt, quick with a correction. He had known Jesse back through the previous campaigns and had seen him climb where others would not. Rodriguez watched Jesse as he moved from tank to tank, a slim figure in muddy webbing. Lieutenant William Harrison, who commanded the nearest M3A1 Stuart, converted with a flame gun bolted into its bow, peered through a slit and cursed softly when he could not see the firing slit of a bunker 60 yards ahead. The flamethrower could vomit fire far enough to reach the enemy's line. The problem was pointing the nozzle through the right hole. Tactics had been rehearsed: line up, mark the target, fire in controlled sweeps, advance. But the jungle refused to follow the book. The smoke from earlier blasts pooled low and thick. The napalm the flame tanks expelled wrapped around trunks and hung as a curtain. When a flame gun spat its cone, the blast itself blurred the view. The heat shimmered, and the engine's roar married with the crack of bullets. Radios died in the interference. Voice commands could not be heard over the thunder of the tracks. In that noise, the most elegant orders became impossible to execute. "Those things choke the crew," Harrison said, voice low and grim. "They can't see where they're supposed to poke that tube." "Then somebody's going to have to point it," Rodriguez answered. "If someone can get up on that rear rail and look." "Bring me a ladder," Harrison muttered. And for a moment the entire idea was laughable. There were no ladders on a slope like that. There were only rails and tracks and the thin, exposed back of a tank. Jesse listened, and his mind moved like it had back in winter storms when a tree had begun to lean and time had narrowed to one clean decision. The flamethrowers had range, somewhere around 80 yards when the fuel held, enough to clear the bunkers at the Hornet's Nest. But their aim was blind. The commander in his head, the neat, cautious voice that had kept him alive in training, whispered the doctrine. Never expose yourself on armor. Never become an observer where you can be shot at. Follow orders. The other voice, the one rooted in the woods and stitched with grief, was louder. It said, if the crews could see the slit, the guns would kill the bunkers, not your men. He climbed. There was no drama in it. He moved like a man climbing a familiar rafter, hands finding metal, boots finding purchase on the mud-slick fenders. The tank beneath him was warm from idling, the armor tasting faintly of oil and sweat. Bullets stitched the air with a sound like a sick metal insect. Up close, the noise was not abstract. It struck the chest and rattled teeth. Men inside the tank chewed tobacco and spit. Their faces were pale in the smeared light of the open hatches. Jesse felt the heat of the exhaust at his back and the slick of sweat inside his collar. From on top of a tank, he could see what the men below could not. An eye-level view of the embankment, the pattern of slits worn into the coral. He did not shout to the commander. Shouting had been tried and failed. He tapped a gloved finger against the armored side until the commander looked up. In a half gesture, he pointed. The commander blinked. The flamethrower's nozzle twitched into line, and then the gun belched a tongue of fire that licked the earth and found the slit. The bunker answered with a stream of metal that struck the tank's plating and sparked without catching the fuel. "That's one," Jesse said, flat and small, more a reporting than a boast. The men on the crew blinked in relief and terror. Rodriguez swore, but there was relief in the swear. It should have been the end of it. Point, fire, advance. It was not yet. Enemy machine guns along the ridgeline had learned to aim at the backs of tanks, at the men who clambered up on them, and the slope gave them cover. A bunker nearer to the left of the column had fired and found the engine deck of a Stuart, and the smell of burning rubber and fuel became immediate. The next tank aft answered with a column of fire that wrapped the hillside, smoke rolling like a black sea. "Get down!" someone shouted, but the shout was drowned by the churn of tracks. Jesse had seconds to leap or to remain visible. A fear ran through him, brief and sharp, that the tank under his feet would be struck and melt around him. He thought of Robert's handwriting, of how small it had been when he wrote asking about home, and of the telegram that had no more than 2 words for life. He thought of the lumber camps where a man could not wait for permission while a tree came down. He leaned forward and pointed. What followed was a blur assembled of short verbs: climb, slide, grab, point again. His hands were blistering before he noticed, hot from handling railings that had been superheated by flame. The fuel in the flame guns built a pressure that made the nozzle judder when it released. Bullets pinged like a faraway rain, and then came closer, their crack closer to an animal's bark. A tracer spooned past and kissed the air. The tank creaked where a round had glanced. From inside one burning Stuart came the muffled sound of someone calling, a syllable that turned into a cough. A hatch swung. Smoke rolled out in a gray tide. The crew inside the burning vehicle were not yet dead, but they were trapped in a hot, dark hell of heat and fumes. Jesse did not hesitate. He had learned under trees how to move a weight that was not yet motionless, how to grab what needed grabbing and not think of the bruise until later. He braced his shoulder against the hatch ring and hauled. Men poured out, coughing and blinking. One of them was small, his face a raw, shining thing with a film of ash, and he clung to a metal strap like a child. Jesse hauled him free and shoved him toward a slit where medics were already working. Another man had been burned across the hands. He let out a sound that curved away from speech into something less shareable. Jesse's palms were hot to the touch. When he lowered his gloves, he felt the skin has reddened, the rawness like a burn from an iron. He had been in the dirt with wounds before, but not like this. These were hands that had been colonized by heat. "You're bleeding," the man said, embarrassed more than pained. "It's only the work," Jesse said, because that was the language of the lumber camps, and it steadied both of them. The rescue was a fragmentary thing that would later be reshuffled into neat sentences for reports and medals. In the moment, it was noise and effort and the clench of muscle, and then a brief, brittle exhale of relief from the men who had been trapped. They had been burned. They had survived. The column, watching, found a new rhythm. The flame guns, now aimed by a man who could see the world from above the tanks, began to sweep the line of slits with a precision that artillery had failed to provide. Lieutenant Harrison's voice, when he spoke after the action, was rough and filled with an odd private gratitude. "He climbed up there like he was fixing a saw on a job," Harrison said later, fingers still shaking from the memory. Stupid? Maybe. Effective? God, yes. Rodriguez, who had been the first to scold him, clapped a hand on Jesse's shoulder until the man winced. "You dumb son of a," he began, the old language bailing out in front of something heavier. The reprimand was more like a benediction. It held both the sting of discipline and the salt of thanks. Military discipline had rules for a reason, to save lives in the aggregate. Jesse had bent one to save men he could see. Command would later argue the point. In the wash of that morning, the argument was academic. The immediate consequence was tactical and stark. Where the flame guns found slits to swallow with fire, bunkers stopped being bunkers and became rubble that could be cleared by infantry and follow-up artillery. The hornet's nest began to unspool. Men moved through openings where none had been hours before. By day's end, the Americans had neutralized the line sufficiently to press forward. Casualties in that specific action remained low. 18 wounded, none killed in the immediate assault at the hornet's nest. Figures that would be stamped into the reports. Small numbers against the broader ledger of Buna's heavy losses, but numbers that mattered to the men who counted their friends by face and name. News travels in war in strange tongues: rumor, report, commendation. A day after the action, officers on the ridge gathered around maps and reports, their faces drawn. Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Hart, who had the authority to formalize acknowledgments, looked at the handwritten accounts and found a pattern, an improvised method that worked where doctrine had not. Men like Hart did not approve technique on sentiment. They approve it on results.
De guia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Início das instruções. Você é narrador, palestrante, com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era: Nikki on sentiment, they approved it on results. Você está no meio de uma frase, pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. The flame tank method Jesse had used, an infantry spotter riding on the turret or hull and pointing the nozzle, was risky, and protocols tried to limit unnecessary risk. But the data was simple. When a soldier who could see directed the flame, bunker after bunker fell silent. Write it down, Hart told Harrison. We need to standardize this if it's going to save lives. It was the sort of bureaucratic late-morning sentence that made Jesse blanch in other contexts. In war, the man who did the thing and the man who wrote the book were not always the same. Jesse's action would be recorded with crisp verbs and clipped measurements, dates, times, unit designations. His name would go into a file and, weeks later, onto a citation. But in the immediate hours, on the slope, the men who had crawled and coughed and been saved by a blistered hand did not speak in forms and citations. They spoke in the way men speak when they have seen a small miracle of work, in a language of cigarettes and jokes and a quiet, private nod that said more than any medal could. Back in the rear, a clerk would later pin a paper to a file. Medal of Honor recommendation, narrative enclosed. The Army would sift. Screens and committees would consider whether a single action should change doctrine. Jesse went on living with his hands like hands had to be lived with. The burns and blisters healed into scars that caught the light at odd angles. And when he saw them, he would remember a man's face half hidden in smoke, and the tree-lined winters that had taught him to move under pressure. In the weeks after Hornet's Nest, engineers and commanders talked about formalizing infantry spotters atop flame tanks. Someone typed up a procedure. Someone else circulated it. Training notes were rewritten to emphasize communication and to add practice drills where a man on the hull would coordinate with the flame crew. Weapon development would take its own slow course, with modifications to later tanks that simplified fire control and protection for men who, like Jesse, had to be exposed to do their job. But medals and doctrine followed later. On the slope, the morning remained in memory, a collage of sounds and small rescues and the smell of burned jungle. Men tucked their losses away and carried them into the next fight. Jesse carried his with the clean economy of a man who worked with his hands. He noticed the grief, then set it under a plan. He had no taste for speeches, and he would not practice heroics. He returned to the squad as the field settled and the next map was unrolled. The jungle, for its part, kept being the jungle, indifferent, patient, and full of small traps. That night, when the men stacked their gear in the lee of an oil drum and let the night's humidity cool the edges of heat, Jesse sat and felt his hands. They itched and tingled where the blisters had opened against the rail. A medic swabbed them and wrapped them with quiet care.
Jesse made a small joke about being a sapling again, and the men laughed, because laughter is how soldiers patch themselves against terror. He did not write home that day. He did not know yet that a document would cross a desk and declare that his was an action worthy of the nation's highest honor. Yet the question of recklessness would not die. Stories of Jesse climbing onto tanks were retold in mess tents with a sharpness. Some called the act stupid, others called it brave. The duality would follow him. It is a strange thing that an act described as foolish could unnerve commanders who had spent years in planning rooms. In those rooms, the commanders learned cautious mathematics, risk versus reward, lives saved versus lives endangered trying to save them. Jesse's decision forced those rooms to accept that sometimes the equation could be recalibrated by a single human judgment in a single thermal second. Days blurred into the slow work of consolidation. The hornet's nest no longer hummed with enemy fire. It became instead a place where engineers walked to pile up the remains of concrete, and where medics tallied burns and bandaged hands. The men who had been rescued by Jesse's quickness lived, and they would tell the tale in a handful of offhand sentences that kept the heroism casual and the memory intact. Even before official reports reached home, small communities in Michigan would begin to whisper about a local man who had climbed atop a tank and pointed a flame into a slit. In the log camps, the story fit. A man who knew how to read the world at shoulder height, who knew the sound a falling limb made, who had once yanked a man out of harm without thinking of rule books. The image of Jesse on the tank rail, fingers pressed to hot metal, became a shorthand for something larger, a belief that ordinary, trained work could alter an extraordinary moment. From now, on that ridge, the war moved forward because a man was willing to be exposed. For men like Harrison and Rodriguez and the tank crews, the judgment was simple. Lives had been spared. For doctrine, the decision planted a seed of reconsideration. For Jesse, the action was not a desire for glory. It was what his hands knew to do when faced with a falling problem and no time to debate. He climbed down from the tank when the immediate danger eased, the mud sucking at his boots. Men patted him on the back, shoved a cigarette into his mouth, even though he did not smoke much, and waited as the column resumed its motion. The telegram in his pocket had not left his mind. When he took his helmet off later, the paper came out with it, and he read Robert's name again, the ink as flat as the morning. He folded it and tucked it into the inward side of his jacket, as who tucks a talisman. The company would move on. The maps would be redrawn, and the learned men of the staff would note the success in their files and add a line, "Spotter on tank proved effective."
He would not stand on top any longer than he had to. The crew watched, faces shaded by the edge of the turret, smoke riding off the engine. Harrison had come up beside him, breathing like a man who had run a long way. Rodriguez, at the other flank, fidgeted with a canteen. None of them asked why Jesse chose to do it. None of them needed to. He was a man whose hands knew what to do. He aimed, not at the slit, but at the bitter black where the earth made a lip. He wanted the blast to lift like a gull and press into the crevice, not pound it from the front. The first flame, there was a hiss and then a roar. It licked the slit and went in. For a tense second, nothing changed. Then heat seared at the tank's face. A blast of smoke answered, and a shape moved away, stumbling. Men inside the slit coughed and fell back. The tanks answered. The second armor, trained now by a simple human signal that meant more than any doctrine, throttled forward, and the sponson guns took aim. The moy of the position gave way under the weight of fire and men. Soldiers poured through the gap, rifles low, shouting. The ridge sang with the small, close music of men attacking. Commands, bombed-out groans, the percussion of a handful of grenades. When the field quieted, the sun had shifted, and the smoke lay in ragged sheets. The engineers went forward to check the slit and found scorched sandbags, a pair of boots twisted under a parapet. A radio operator from a nearby battalion tramped back with news. 2 prisoners taken, 6 dead, the rest fled. They would be counted later. For now, the tanks needed to be fed, the column needed to move, and men needed to breathe. Harrison clapped Jesse on the shoulder hard enough to bruise. "You saved us, boy," he said. His voice was raw with something like admiration and something like the relief of a man who had watched a gamble pay off. It would be a line in the morning reports and a rumor at home and a wedge between doctrine and improvisation. It would also be why Jesse could not sleep that night. They moved on as dusk gathered. The jungle closed behind them in a slow, sullen hush. Engineers cleared the road. Men picked through the smoking wreckage of the hornet's nest, and medics stayed late, tending burns and cutting charred fabric away. Jesse walked with a small packet tucked in his shirt, a folded telegram with Robert's name. The name felt heavier than it should. It had been a hammer that morning. Now, in the cooling air, it was a stone he carried under his lawn. At a bivouac near a ruined plantation, they laid out the men in ranks of blankets and improvised hammocks. Fires burned low. The kitchen detail made coffee, and the scent rose like a ghost from a country Jesse had not seen in a year. Men swapped cigarettes and small private stories, a dog that had survived back home, a sister engaged, a father's last letter. They spoke softly because the night had a way of making sound into a threat.
Jesse found a quiet place and sat with his back against the tank's flank. The metal still vibrated faintly with heat. The stars pricked cold and clear beyond the canopy. He unfolded the telegram again and read the words as if the ink might change. The message was brief and bureaucratic. a name, a place, a date. But it had already opened something inside him that would not close. Robert, kid from the 42nd, who used to whistle at dawn and had once swapped Jesse a chocolate bar for the right to sit at the radio, was gone. Guilt did not come as a thunderbolt. It came as a slow peeling, all the small choices layered into one. The men who had lived under the hornet's nest would go on and tell the story, and what the telling would omit was the cost exacted elsewhere. The soldiers who had fallen that morning were not numbers to him. They were faces. Each body dug into him like the splinters he had once pulled out of his own hands in the logging camps. He thought of the telegrams he had seen before the war, of weddings and babies and small trivialities, and he thought of how a sheet of paper could change the angle of a life. He felt the tug of two worlds, the disciplined, mechanical world of orders and strategy, and the crooked, human world where a man did what his hands told him to. He had been lauded for marrying the two. He did not feel easy in the praise. Jesse. Harrison's voice came low from the shadow of the turret. He sat beside him and kept a respectful distance. "Yeah?" Jesse said. Harrison had that look men had when they wanted to tell you something but didn't want to put it on a scale. "They've got a runner coming through in the morning. Headquarters wants to see you. For a debrief, they said. Maybe a medal talk. You ought to get some sleep." "You tell them the story," Jesse said. His voice was flat. He did not want the story made into a speech or a lesson. "I will," Harrison said, and there was no mocking in his tone. "We all will. You did good." They sat in silence after that, listening to the minor chorus of the camp settling. Men snored, men cursed under the ants, men prayed, the small liturgies of nights in the field. Jesse folded the telegram and tucked it back into the inner collar of his jacket, where it warmed against him like a secret. The debrief the next day was what debriefs often are, a wash of questions that translate a human moment into categories and checkboxes. Officers scribbled in notebooks. A major in a pressed uniform asked Jesse to reproduce his actions step by step. Jesse told it plainly, the slit, the angle, the flame. He said nothing of the feeling in his chest when he read Robert's name. He watched the major's pen etch in the margin, watched the tidy air around the desk make a tidy narrative of what had been violent and ragged. "You were lucky," the major said finally. "You should consider a recommendation for what?" Jesse asked, not wanting the new title to sit on his shoulders like another medal. "For leadership, for initiative. Men respond to men who act." Jesse thought of the log camps in Michigan and the men who had trusted him because he worked steady. Initiative, in their language, had been quiet. "I did what needed doing," he said. "That's all." "That is exactly why we want to note it," the major said. He taped a thin strip of paper into the file and pushed it toward Jesse. "Men like you set examples." Examples are lighter to carry than medals, Jesse thought. Or perhaps they were heavier. He accepted the paper with the same lack of ceremony he had used to accept a cigarette pushed into his mouth the morning he climbed down from the tank. They moved on again. The maps crackled under gloved fingers, and the column marched toward a place named on orders as if it were just another coordinate. The hornet's nest had been one battle among many. Somewhere on those orders was the small bureaucratic triumph. a line recommending the use of tanks in a closer support role. Strategy men would write memos. Engineers would test the method under controlled conditions. Men under fire would keep improvising. Jesse's name began to spread in the way names do in war, not on posters, but in murmurs at the mess table, and in the way a man would widen his step if he sensed the same hazard. He did not try to stop it. He walked and worked and allowed his hands to be measured in the way they always had been: steady, practical, reliable. When he fixed a stuck gear on a half-track, he did so without talk of heroics. When a young private asked him what he had felt that day, Jesse shrugged and said, "Just fear, then work." Fear, he thought, had a timing of its own. It came as a hot spike, and then a cold wash. Courage, if it existed, lived in the thin space between that spike. For some men, courage was a habit they had learned at home, to go where the need was and do what was necessary without waiting for applause. For others, it was something learned in a fire of moments. For Jesse, it felt simple: a hand, a flame, a choice. Once, late in the afternoon, when the column halted behind a river that had swollen its banks with recent rains, Jesse sat with Rodriguez and swapped the small irritations of the road. Rodriguez had an ease with language and gestures men liked. He mimed the way a lieutenant had tried to direct traffic in the mud, and everyone laughed. Laughter made things movable for a time. "You gonna keep that telegram on you?" Rodriguez asked, nodding toward Jesse's jacket. "Till it isn't worth carrying," Jesse said. He fingered the fold, feeling its edges as if the paper might fray. "It'll be one of those things they put in a box and send home with your wife," Rodriguez said, half teasing, half bearing a sadness. Jesse did not have a wife.
Jesse did not have a wife. Right place, right time. Men were in front of me. I did what had to be done. The colonel took the statement into his ledger and nodded as if it were enough. Outside, men smoked and laughed and swapped the endless jokes that kept them from thinking of the tally of loss. Inside, papers were made neat. When he returned to his company, Harrison was waiting near a pile of crates, arms folded. He carried a paper cup of coffee and offered it to Jesse like a peace offering. "You gonna let them put your name in the lights?" Harrison asked. "They'll put a name on a piece of paper," Jesse said, "and that'll be that. It won't change anything that happened." "It might change things for the next kid who faces that ridge," Harrison said. "Maybe it keeps him from dying." Jesse looked at him then, and for a moment the two men, who had said less to each other than they had with gestures and trust, understood the same thing. Small acts of sense could be the margin between life and death. The moral weight of recognition did not diminish the work. It only changed who would speak of it. That night, the column pushed into a low valley and set up a perimeter. Men wrote letters, chewed on stale bread, and sat in pockets of dark and light. Jesse lay on his blanket and watched the ceiling of leaves. He thought of Robert and of the boy's chest that had stopped breathing, and of how, when you had ears tuned to the world, you could hear the tremble in words like regret and luck. He found himself thinking of the future in a way he had not allowed. Not of medals or mentions, but of the small, ordinary life he had left. He imagined himself back in Michigan, with sawdust under his nails, with Alma laughing in the kitchen while he wiped off his boots. Those images were like lights in the fog, not promises, but destinations. "You're thinking about home," murmured Rodriguez from across the blanket. "Sometimes it feels like I'm on a bridge," Jesse said. One foot on this side, one on the other. I don't know which way I'll step when the time comes." Rodriguez nodded. "Maybe neither. Maybe you'll carry both with you. That's what a lot of us do." In the morning, the commander came around with a photographer and an orderly to pin a citation onto Jesse's chest. The camera's flash carved a white line across faces. Men posed the way men do for good luck. Jesse felt the flat weight of the tape and the crispness of the paper under his fingers. The photographer asked him to smile. Jesse managed it because he had to. Later, as they prepared to move out, a courier arrived with new orders. A detachment to screen a flank, a town to secure. The map moved their names and their lives along like chips on a board. Men loaded and strapped and checked. For Jesse, the rhythm of work became the only honest thing. Check the tanks, oil the joints, read the face of a map as if it were a living thing. A rumor circulated that the Hornet's Nest story would be used in training, a case study, a cautionary note, a demonstration. Men argued over interpretations, some saying it proved the value of initiative, others warning that luck had a short memory. The fighting world is full of such arguments. They keep the higher ranks awake and the lower ranks wary. On a narrow road, the platoon halted at midday. A small village lay ahead, smoke curling from chimneys, women watching from doorways. Jesse felt the tension that precedes contact, not the wide bore of battle, but the prickly sense of possible violence. He led a sweep with two other men, moving house to house with methodical care. In a doorway, an old man held his hands up and spoke in halting words. A child clung to the man's leg and stared at the soldiers with solemn eyes. The village had been pressed into the war's periphery and now stood to be treated by its shifting fortunes. Jesse spoke to the man's son in broken phrases and handed over a can of food. The exchange was small and human in a way the maps never bothered to account for. Afterward, as they walked back to the tanks, Harrison came up beside him and said, "You know, once this is over, you ought to come down to the river. Take a few days, see the town again. Maybe you'll find the house just the way you left it." Jesse smiled without enthusiasm. "If I'm still me when I get there," he said. "That's part of going back," Harrison said. "You change a little, but the house waits." They laughed, and the sound slid into the heat. The column moved again. Men hummed tired songs to keep the time, and the day's work folded into itself like a map creased for the road. That night, as the moon rose thin and the sounds of the jungle took on the soft chorus of unknown things, Jesse climbed up onto the tank and sat with his legs dangling over the rim. The metal was cool to the touch. He took out the telegram and smoothed it with a thumb. The ink had not changed. The name remained a small monument. He thought of the men who had died on the ridge and of those who had lived because a man chose to point a flame. He thought of how history is made of choices that seemed small at the time, and of how, in the ledger of war, some lines are written thick and some are just a smudge. Below him, the camp slept in uneven shapes. Someone laughed once, a short bark of private joy. He folded the telegram and tucked it into his shirt again, closer than a talisman now, closer than a map. He thought of a different kind of map, the one that leads you back to the small life you left, and he pressed his forehead to his knee and breathed. There would be more ridges. There would be more slits. There would be mornings when a single choice would stand between a man living and a man not. He did not know whether his hands would always find the right thing. He only knew they had today. Far away, in a room with a lamp and a stove, Alma would lay a cloth over a table and think of a man who was somewhere across the ocean. She would not know the names of ridges and slits, but she would know the feel of boots on a porch and the steadiness of a man who fixed what was broken. When Jesse finally went home, if he went home, he would wrestle with the medals and the stories. For now he sat on the tank and watched the sky, and the stars seemed to hold the world patient and far away. At dawn, the column rolled out again. Men shook off sleep, and the road took them like a tide. The orders led them toward a ridge that, on some maps, was nothing more than a line. For Jesse, the map meant a place where people lived and fought and prayed. He checked his gear, felt the fold of the telegram against his chest, and climbed into the field. The ridge rose up like a challenge. Men tightened their grips on rifles, and the tank engines growled. For Jesse, everything compressed into the present moment. The smell of dust, the metal beneath his hands, the small mechanical certainty that practice gives. He thought of the hornet's nest, and the way a flame could find a seam. He thought of Robert, and of letters, and of a house with a warm stove. He would act again when the time came. He did not promise himself heroics, only the work of hands that knew, the stubborn refusal to let habits of caution override the chance to save a life in front of him. The column moved forward, and men whispered a prayer of sorts. Some to God, some to luck, some to nothing at all. As the tanks rolled into the shadow of the ridge, Jesse felt the old calculation beat through him. Look, decide, act. He put his hand on the rail and steeled himself. The map lay open, the ridge loomed, and the day's work waited. He had one chance. He did what his hands knew to do. The tanks saw, the shells blew, the world shifted, small and bright as a coin turning in sunlight. And for the men who followed him, the margins changed. Somewhere down the road, the war continued to make fools of plan and heroes of habit. For Jesse, the meaning of the morning would be discovered slowly, in a medal tucked away, in a story told in a camp, in a letter read late by a woman with a clean stove. He moved with the field and with the men, and the day took them onward.